I saved what is probably the best topic here for last because it's the one that is arguably the most useful in terms of fixing a problem that's been around in Windows for a very long time. Fine-grained password policies, as I had mentioned in the introduction, provide a way for you to distribute different password policies to different users or groups of users, depending on the needs of your organization. Now, fine-grained password policies and the password settings objects that configure them have been around since Windows Server 2008, but a lot of people didn't really use them in '08 because in order to configure them, you had to dig deeply into that tool ADSI Edit, which is the tool I like to refer to as the tool you can easily use to completely destroy your Active Directory. It's just far too easy with ADSI Edit to start digging into Active Directory and destroying things you really don't want to. As a result, Microsoft has pulled PSOs and the creation and management of PSOs down here into the Active Directory Administrative Center, or the ADAC. The ADAC, if you haven't used it, is just a PowerShell-oriented version of the ADUC, the Active Directory Users and Computers console, that provides just another way that you can go about managing your users and computers here in AD. If I click here on company and then I come down here to, I don't know, company users, for example, I can just see the users that exist here in my domain. You may recognize some of these users from those we worked with back in the 70-410 course for Pluralsight. If I look at any of the users here, I can right click and choose properties and just see all the different properties associated with a particular user. Now it's here also where we can do a variety of other more advanced Active Directory things as well, not the least of which is configuring these password settings objects. Now the hard part here is actually just finding them the first time. In order to find your password settings objects, just ignore that this exists here because I've already found it here in my tree. I need to come here under the tree view and then under System, and then down here under Password Settings Container right here. It's in this location that we would go about creating a PSO to define a different password policy for a specific user or group. Now, in order to be able to do this, your domain functional level has to be at least Windows Server 2008 or later. My suspicion is that most Active Directory domains at this point are beyond the Windows Server 2008 days, but if you're not, you'll have to raise the domain functional level to at least Server 2008. Once you've done that, you can come here to create a password settings object, define the characteristics of the policy you want to set, and then apply it to a user or a group. So let's say this is our PSO here, and the precedence on this will be a number. So this is just an integer number, like 10, for example. You can set this to any number you want, the absolute value of which has no importance at all. It's just the relative value between this precedence number and some other precedence number that determines which one applies to a particular user or group. Now for this PSO, we then need to configure what the policy should be. So password length, password history, minimum password age, the lockout policy, and so on. For each of these, we could, for example, change the password age, I don't know, here from 42 to 90 days. And then down here at the bottom, configure who this password settings object should apply to. So if I hit the add button here, I can enter in a group, let's say the IT group again, of people that should have their passwords changed every 90 days as opposed to every 42 days. If I hit the OK button here, that will go about creating the password settings object, and it'll appear here in our Active Directory environment. Now, a couple of very important gotchas here with PSOs, one of which is exceptionally important. You have just seen every setting that can be configured through a PSO. But very importantly, that's not every setting that can be made on a particular user. And arguably, if you start digging around in group policy, there are far more password-oriented type settings that you just don't see here. So recognize that the ones you see here are the only types of settings that can be configured via a PSO. Recognize also that when we configured this, we configured it to a group of users. PSOs and fine-grained password policies can be applied to user accounts and global security groups only. You can't apply them to computer accounts. So this is intended entirely for users and not computers. And then for the final gotcha, I want to talk a bit about this precedence value that we configured here and just the way in which different PSOs can be applied to a specific user or group. Recognize that I can create as many PSOs as I want, and I can configure those PSOs to apply to whichever groups I want to as well. This should automatically just highlight in your mind that an individual user could potentially have multiple different PSOs that would potentially apply. It's this precedence value here, among some other rules, that determines which PSO applies to that user, because only a single PSO will apply to a user at a time. Let me bring up here a little slide that I want to show you that talks a bit about the precedence for password settings objects. Now, rule number 1 is that lower precedence values, the number 10 that we applied just a second ago, will override PSOs with higher precedence values. So the PSO overall will have a precedence value one assumes of 1, and other PSOs will have values of numbers that are higher. PSOs also that are directly applied to a user object will always override those applied to groups. So you'll notice we applied that to the IT group a second ago. If we were to apply that directly to a user object, the precedence value no longer has any bearing, because when that PSO is applied directly to a user object, it always overrides those applied to groups. And then for our third rule, which is the reason why I actually put this PSO conversation at the end of this module, is that any PSO settings will override those that are applied via GPOs to the domain. So all that talk that we had at the beginning of this module about the different domain password policy settings and lockout policy settings and Kerberos policy settings, any of those that are configured through PSOs are going to override those applied through group policy.